Here are the next few pages of the Cloud Tea Monkey story written by Peat and Elspeth Graham. She was awakened by a great outburst of screeching and whooping. The adults were back, and they were excited, bouncing from branch to rock and rock to branch, calling loudly. The young ones fled from Tashi's lap to their mothers. The mothers scolded the males for their madness. Raja sat in the middle of the shade, ignoring all the monkey business. He was watching Tashi. The basket stood beside him. She went to it and looked in. The basket was almost full of small budding sprigs of tea, and Tashi knew straight away that it was unusual. The leaves were the color of emeralds and spangled with a tiny droplet of water, so that the basket seemed full of green light and a rich, sweet scent. The basket was even harder to manage now that it was full. It took Tashi a long time to drag it through the baking heat between the endless rows of bushes. When she came into the clearing around the overseer's station, surprise stopped her dead. The tea pickers were standing in a long line behind their basket, whispering and giggling nervously. Tashi hauled her basket over to where her aunt stood at the end of the line. Sonam looked down at the child with big astonished eyes, but did not speak. The overseer was marching about. He looked like a man whose brains were on fire. "Silence!" he yelled. "Silence! Stand straight! Be quiet!" But it was not the overseer's mad behavior that interested Tashi. In the open space beside the hut was a cart with 2 wooden wheels. The 2 enormous oxen that had pulled it to the plantation stood twitching their tails at the bothersome flies. The driver was a very small man wearing a white turban, and he seemed to be asleep. In the cart there was a chair with cushions and a tall back like a throne. It had a canopy of purple silk, and in the chair, in the purple shadow of the purple silk, sat a man, made of silver light like the moon. The overseer spoke. "We are so honored," he said. "We are very, very honored to be visited today by His Excellency, the Royal Tea Taster himself." The overseer turned and made a creepy, crouching gesture towards the man who looked like the moon. "As you know, His Excellency, the Royal Tea Taster, travels the whole world to find teas that are good enough to be drunk by Her Majesty the Empress." The tea pickers whispered to each other. The overseer went dark in the face. "Silence! His Excellency, the Royal Tea Taster, will now examine the tea in each of your baskets. And I am sure, quite sure, that he will find that the tea we grow on our plantation is the finest in the world." The Royal Tea Taster pulled himself up from the throne and stood in the sunlight. Now Tashi could see him clearly. Gold threads glittered in his blue turban, and his long white coat was so heavily embroidered with silver that it seemed to be made out of white fire. His mustache was like a spread of snowy wings. His Royal Tea Taster strolled over to the line of women. He reached down into the first basket and picked out a sprig of tea. He held it up and looked at it very closely. Frowning, he crushed the leaves and stuck his long nose into his cupped hand and sniffed a long, noisy sniff. Then he tossed the tea aside. He did this a few times along the line, but more often he just glanced at a basket of tea and moved on. The overseer followed at a respectful distance, his hands rubbing each other, his face wearing a sick and frightened grin. The royal tea taster was quite close to Sonam and Tashi when the overseer lost control of himself and dared to speak. "Excellency, sir," he said, "this tea, our tea, is very fine, is it not? Is it not the most beautiful tea?" The royal tea taster lifted his nose as if he had smelled a dead rat. "Your tea," he said, "your tea is ordinary." The overseer moaned and bent almost double as if he had great pain in the stomach. The royal tea taster moved on and at last stood before Sonam and Tashi. Tashi looked up into his eyes, which were almost as deep and dark as the eyes of Raja. The royal tea taster turned to walk away. Then he stopped. His nose twitched. He came back to the basket that stood in front of Tashi and dipped his plump hand into it, testing the warm dampness of the leaf. He took a single spring and studied it, twirling it between his fingers. He crushed it and sniffed it twice. "Where did you pick this?" He spoke to Sanam, not to Tashi. Sonam said, "Sir, I did not pick it. This child did. Her name is Tashi. She is the daughter of my sister who is sick." The royal tea taster took a step back so that he could see Tashi over the gleaming bulge of his belly. His look was very stern. He lifted a hand and clicked his fingers. Describe a character. Now, describe the royal tea taster. Write the sentences using adjectives and adverbs. Answer these questions. How did he arrive? What was he wearing? How did he behave? How did the other people feel about him?